in this episode.
Heidegger's approach to say something like reality in paragraph 43 of Being and Time as, I think of it as an existential deepening of transcendental idealism. So transcendental idealism in Kant is the idea that we live in an empirically real world, right? There's a real world full of real stuff. That's indisputable. And that wasn't the case for Berkeley. But that world is a world which we give order to, we give shape to, and that's what Kant thinks the categories of the understanding are what give shape and order to that empirically real world. So Kant's claim is that an empirical realist is also a transcendental idealist, that the world is indeed a really real world, but it's a world which is shaped and ordered by human activity, or it's observer dependent, you could say. And I see that as that's true. What that Kant's problem is that Kant operates for Heidegger at the level of what he calls the present at hand, so that Kant's philosophy for Heidegger is the right intuition with the wrong ontology. Heidegger thinks that the present at hand, by which he means the seeing the world with philosopher's spectacles, seeing the world in intellectualist terms, theoreticist terms, seeing the world and then asking questions like, well, how do I know that you've got a mind, or you're a robot, or how do you know that I am who I say I am, and so on and so forth. All of these questions arise with the wrong ontology, the ontology of the present at hand. So what Heidegger tries to do in Being and Time is to give us another ontology, which is an ontology of the ready to hand, of the handiness, of the availability of the world. And this is where Dreyfus is right. This is a kind of pragmatist approach. And Heidegger's pragmatism, in quotation marks, it's both realist and idealist, right? It's both committed to the idea that there's a really real world, and that really real world is something which is shaped and apprehended by the observers that understand that world.
Hey everyone, welcome to this conversation with the philosopher and writer Simon Critchley. I've got to say, Simon's a real philosophical raconteur, and it really is a pleasure to talk to someone like him, because as a interviewer or an interlocutor, when I have a guest like Simon, I ask him a question and then he'll go on a really interesting story. It's always something fresh, something new. Even if it's a very theoretical, philosophical point, he makes it interesting. He, brings up some anecdotes, gives a few examples, grabs film or cinema or some story from his own personal life, and just makes the dialogue really enlightening and makes it alive. And so for me, on the other side of this, I don't feel like I need to push him or try to make him feel like he's being contrived to answer certain questions. And unfortunately, we were a bit short for time, so we couldn't really get into a bit more of the theoretical questions I want to ask him. Especially, I wanted to ask him his thoughts on Hegel, because we primarily discussed Heidegger in this podcast. But nonetheless, when he releases his next book, which he told me was on mysticism, I'm hoping to invite him on again on the podcast to discuss his work, and then perhaps I could ask him some of the other theoretical questions that I had planned for the podcast. But regardless, it was a very enlightening and edifying conversation. I didn't mention Heidegger. I told Simon already, but during the pandemic, I listened to his lectures on Apply-degger, and interestingly, at the time, I didn't even know who the hell Simon Critchley was. I just found these random lectures on Heidegger on YouTube. I think it's a 20-part series, if I'm not mistaken. And I just got on them and I was hooked. It was fantastic. And it was only recently when one of my friends, I'll mention her name. Her name's Shay. When she told me about memory theater, I started reading in the work, and I was like, oh, Simon Critchley, familiar name. Who's that? Oh, it's the Heidegger guy. And that's when I was like, brilliant. He's written a work on fiction, he's written a novel, and then, he's a brilliant, insightful philosopher. In any case, this is a long-winded way of saying that this podcast is predominantly on Heidegger and phenomenology, but also we did, of course, focus or discuss some of Simon's work, especially his work on Infinitely Demanding, his book, and this idea, which he's probably kind of renowned for, or infamous for, let's say, that philosophy starts not from wonder, but rather philosophy starts from disappointment, which, when I read that in Infinitely Demanding, hit me like a ton of bricks, because I just feel like that's true. In fact, most people who get into philosophy are probably people who are disappointed and have been let down by our life world. But before we get to the podcast, of course, a bit of a formal introduction. As per usual, Professor Simon Critchley is a philosopher and the Hans Jonas Professor of Philosophy at the New School for Social Research in New York. He's the author of numerous books, including Infinitely Demanding, on Heidegger's Being and Time, which I highly recommend, especially the first lecture Simon gives called Heidegger for Beginners, which is excellent. He covers so many brilliant topics and interesting topics in phenomenology. And the other book is, of course, Memory Theater, perhaps the book he's most well known for by the general public outside of philosophy. And then Tragedy, the Greeks and Us. Since 2010, Professor Critchley has moderated the New York Times philosophy series, The Stone, and in 2020, he released Apply-degger, a long-form podcast series on Martin Heidegger's Being and Time, which again, I highly recommend, and it's great, especially given that it's free, publicly available on YouTube. Having said that, without further ado, here's my conversation with Professor Simon Critchley. I'll probably start off by reading a short excerpt from your book, Infinitely Demanding, from the introduction. Simon, you claim that philosophy does not begin in an experience of wonder, as ancient tradition contends, but rather, I think, with the indeterminate but palpable sense that something desired has not been fulfilled, that a fantastic effort has failed. Philosophy begins in disappointment. It's one of your famous lines, I think. So, firstly, would you want to comment on this excerpt, but also perhaps elucidate on what you mean by philosophy begins in disappointment?
Well, is the world wonderful or is the world disappointing?
More the latter, isn't it?
Right, right. So, and if philosophy is, you know, if philosophy is thinking, is its time, is its time in thought, then we have to begin from disappointment. It seems to me, so it's a good way of making a contrast with a view which is it's just a popular view, the idea of wonder, because it sounds cool, and but if you look at the sources for it, it's a view that Aristotle ascribes to those people that came way before him, the physiologi, philosophers of nature. He thought they experienced wonder in relationship to nature, the heavens. Aristotle doesn't claim that he experiences wonder. So it's a view that was already out of fashion by the time of the 5th century BC. So the idea there is that the modern world is most certainly an experience of disappointment, and that's where you have to begin. It's not where you end. So people often get are you the disappointment guy? So no, philosophy begins in disappointment. It doesn't end in disappointment. Well, that's where it begins. So, and I think it's. I mean, I don't say it as much these days as I used to, but I still think it's right. Yeah.
Indeed, indeed. Yeah. Do you think that there's a very like epochal way of thinking, I guess, but that in terms of times when philosophy becomes most pertinent, for instance, Zizek, who you've written polemics with, uh, he claims that, oh, now we live in this time where these grand metaphysical questions are coming back into our culture, kind of like the time that, let's say, the German idealist went through. Or do you think that there are these periods in human history where philosophy becomes most pertinent, or that it's more ahistorical or acontextual as to how philosophical development or progress, if you could call it that, takes place?
Good question, very difficult question to answer. It's hard to find progress in philosophy, you know. The questions that we're asking are the same questions that the Plato and Aristotle asked. So we don't have answers for them. So you might want to say philosophy is a series of perennial questions without answers, and that's a good way of thinking about it. Philosophy is a movement into perplexity about basic issues, and sophistry or ideology always claims to have an answer. This is what this means. This, and you know, and so on and so forth. So, if you claim to know, then you're selling something. You're selling snake oil or whatever it might be. So, on one way of looking at it is that philosophy really exhibits no progress over thousands of years, and then it's also, you know, where do you even say it begins? Does it begin with the Greeks? Does it begin with?
I think we lost you there for a bit, Simon.
Yeah, I think that was at my end. There's something happens in this building I'm in that only happens during business hours, but normally by this time it's pretty. So anyway, but I've got another Wi-Fi.
Oh, great. Right now, that's all fine. After doing podcasts for almost 2 years with people all over the world, I'm kind of used to this now, so it's totally fine.
So we might get another breakage like that.
That's
Anyway, I was saying, so philosophy exhibits no progress on fundamental issues, we could say. And then it's a question of opinion, really. I mean, it's anybody that claims to have, you know, some special insight into this is lying. There does seem to be a connection between. I mean, philosophy seems to be particularly creative at certain critical points in history. So we can think about, you know, the 13th century and the rise of scholasticism, and that which comes out of that confluence of thinking in the Arabic world, of Greek thinking in the Arabic world, and then that finding its feet in Paris and Bologna and the beginnings of universities, and that, or you could say the 17th century, the rise of the scientific view of things, which is also a period of intense conflicts, war, and we could, if we look at the 20th century, there's no doubt that, I mean, the First and Second World Wars were not great, really, but they did provide stimulus for philosophical thinking, and which itself is quite interesting. First World War, you get Wittgenstein, Rosenzweig, Lukács, Heidegger for sure, and the Second World War really produces generations of philosophers that are really, you know, doing high-level, interesting work. Where are we now? I don't know. I think there's a renewed interest in philosophy, and you know, I've been trying to help that along in my little way over the years. But it's and in many ways, in a way, the internet has been kind to philosophy in the way that it's been unkind to the novel, which was that was the cultural form that dominated the world that I grew up in. People read novels. Now they watch Netflix series, and maybe they've got some space for short form blogs and articles and things like that, ideas which are more easily digested. So perhaps it's a good time for philosophy, but it's not a good time institutionally. And philosophy is, you know, there are different views of philosophy. One view is that, you know, philosophy is just thinking and it can take place anywhere. and philosophy should be in the streets, and that's fine. And that goes all the way back to the Cynics in thinking in public in ancient Greece, often without clothes on, or masturbating and living in barrels and doing crazy things. Another view is that philosophy is something which has always required an institutional framework, and that's what the academy was for Plato, the Lyceum for Aristotle, and so on and so forth. So the institutional framework for the last couple of hundred years has been the university. And is interesting philosophy coming out of universities at this point? I don't think so. I really don't. There's a lot of smart people, but not really much happening. So that would be one kind of half answer to that difficult question. What do you think?
Oh, I don't know what to think. I mean, I would say I joke around that, there's a radical theologian called Peter Rollins. I'm not sure if you're aware of him. He works within the Hegelian Zizekhian tradition, and he says what's really interesting about philosophy is that it's this thing that's nothing, but its own nothingness you could talk about forever. It's not like a substantial thing, which it's like a useless thing, but in its a useless thing, yeah, in its uselessness, you could kind of engage with it for a lifetime, and that's personally how I feel about it. Um,
Sure.
and
It's use it's certainly useless. It doesn't, it doesn't boil cabbages, as a philosopher used to say. It doesn't do anything. It's certainly a disastrous career choice for anybody
but
thinking of going into it.
but for that
You know,
for the point though is, Simon, like I was discussing this with a few of my fellow philosophy aficionados, let's say. I mean,
Mhm.
it's like, okay, once you read Simon Critchley, what else do you do? Do you go and read, How to Win Friends and Influence People? Like, what do you like? It's like once you read a philosophy book, it's like, what else do you do with your life? It's like, do you read 7 Habits of Highly Effective People? It seems like the rest of the world for me seems quite dull once I read Memory Theater or 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 a book by Heidegger. So,
Oh, good. That's great. I mean, I'll take that as a compliment.
oh,
So
it
yeah,
is, it is, it is.
I've been trying my best over the years to keep it interesting, and also to be as far as possible free of free of a kind of a modishness. I mean, there are things that I used to write and think about that perhaps I think about less now, but I've tried to keep moving off in right angles, and trying to find new things to think about, because it keeps me interested. What you're meant to do in philosophy is you're meant to be a specialist on a very, very small thing, and then work on that very small thing until you die, and you get known as the philosopher that works on that very small thing. And my view has always been philosophy is much more, throwing as much shit at the wall as possible and seeing what sticks, and also seeing what works in terms of audiences and students and things like that. So, and I don't, I have, I'm a human being with passions and interests and obsessions, and I want to write about those too. And I don't think that being, you know, uh, an academic should prevent me from doing that if I can try and find something interesting to say. So for me, it's a kind of it's the attempt to kind of manifest a kind of freedom of thought, wherever that might lead one.
Certainly, certainly. All right, this leads me to a lot of questions. I want to ask you a
Okay.
few personal questions, but also you make some really interesting points here. So one would be, I'm sure you're aware, Heidegger, when he lectures on Aristotle, he famously says that Aristotle was a man who was born, he wrote books, and he died. So
Yeah.
the implication, and a lot of more like contemporary philosophers quote that and say that you know the philosopher doesn't matter, the person behind the philosophy, it's useless.
Yeah.
But correct me if I'm wrong, according to some of the interviews or maybe perhaps talks you've done, you do think it's important to pay attention to kind of the philosopher's background, culture, heritage, history, be it may. So I guess the question is, is it purely the philosophy that matters for you, or do you also think the history of the philosopher, the person who did the philosophy, also matters?
That matters too. That matters too, for sure. And I mean, I wrote a book a long time ago, which was around the same time as Infinitely Demanding, a little bit after, called The Book of Dead Philosophers. And that Book of Dead Philosophers, it was 192 deaths of philosophers, kind of in chronological order. And it was I had access to a fantastic library, and I had a research assistant that helped me, and it was a lot of fun because I was writing about things that I didn't people that I hadn't really read, so I was writing very fast, and it was great. And this was an attempt to revive what's called the doxographic tradition in philosophy, which is really the lives of philosophers. And there's certainly within where we begin, let's say within 19th and 20th century academic philosophy, there's a hostility to biography and to anything concerned with personal details. And that's really begun to shift in the last 20, 30 years. So there were really good biographies written of major figures like Ray Monk's book on Wittgenstein and so on and so forth. And so I think one argument there would be that biography provides a way in. It provides a way for people to feel less intimidated by this thing, philosophy, this, thing which sounds huge and deep and inaccessible. And if you can look at the lives of these people, it's a way of humanizing them, bringing them down to earth and making them acceptable. And that's fine. So as a way in, it's really good. I mean, there are philosophical questions, which are philosophical questions, but I find biography, it's really good as a way in. And also philosophy begins, the standard view in Plato's dialogues with, dialogues which feature somebody called Socrates who didn't write. And 5 of those dialogues are concerned with the trial and execution of Socrates. So they're biographical exercises. So there is, I think the idea that we can separate life and work is ridiculous. And I don't think we can reduce work to life or explain work by life, but there is a connection. But you've got to have something interesting to say, right? I mean, we wouldn't be interested in Spinoza if he was just a lens grinder. I mean, maybe he could be a great lens grinder, but he was a lens grinder and he wrote the ethics, and it's the two things together. So you want to know. So if there's someone who's made a real contribution to philosophy, then their life suddenly becomes really rather interesting. And if that's a way of spreading the word, getting people interested, and also, as I said before, of bringing philosophers down to earth, then great, I'm all for it.
Yeah. So I'm not going to ask you about the whole binary question between analytic and continental philosophy. You've already been asked that, and I think I don't want to ask you the same question again. But I do want to ask you something regarding the type of philosopher you are, because and correct me if I'm wrong, Simon, I have this understanding that when it comes to more like the Anglo-Saxon or Anglo-American analytic philosophy, they're more interested in the philosophy of language and like propositional truth and what is true, whereas a hermeneutic philosopher, perhaps coming more from the scholastic tradition, are more interested in the meaning of a text, the meaning of things. So firstly, I'm wondering if my characterization is accurate. Yeah, that's the difference between an analytic and more of a hermeneutic philosopher. And what would you consider yourself to be, a hermeneutic or an analytic in that case?
Okay. Well, the analytic continental distinction is pretty dull and has taken up a lot of bandwidth in institutional navel gazing in during my career, and but it does go back to the 19th century, and it goes back to a pair of essays written by John Stuart Mill. And in those essays, one of which is on Jeremy Bentham, the great utilitarian thinker. The other is on Coleridge, the romantic poet. And these two essays, 1832 and 1840, they talk about analytic and continental. And Coleridge at that point is seen as the representative of the continental tradition, the Germano-Coleridgean doctrine, I think John Stuart Mill calls it. And in making that distinction between Benthamites and Coleridgeans, analytic and continental, Mill says they ask two sorts of questions. The analytic philosopher asks the question of anything: is it true? The continental philosopher asks the question: what is the meaning of it? What is the meaning of it? So we can divide things up in terms of truth questions, which are empirical questions, questions which science can answer, or we can work out with logic, and then questions of meaning, which are questions which require, and interpretation is hermeneutics, and that's what people like me are in the business of doing with phenomena, with things. So, do I think of myself as a hermeneutic philosopher? Not really, but I suppose I am. I think of myself, I during the pandemic in 2020, I began to call myself. I came out as an existential phenomenologist, and I love saying that. I'm an existential phenomenologist, and that's kind of what I am. For me, it's phenomenology is a way of describing life, meaning, human relations, all those phenomena, and what you're describing is how they show up in existence in our everyday lives. So existential phenomenology for me is fine. I'll take that, and it doesn't necessarily have any presuppositions, metaphysical presuppositions, unlike, say, theology, or unlike, say, psychoanalysis, which has all sorts of metaphysical presuppositions. We're just trying to describe our life together in the world as best we can, and think about what it means, and then also what it might mean to live in other ways. And that type of philosophy is, for me, is very open and very amenable to other types of approaches. So I'm very interested in work that goes on in anthropology, in literature, in all areas of human endeavor kind of fascinate me. History. So people like me believe that you can't do philosophy without the history of philosophy. That's just a kind of a non-starter. History is a precondition. History is really what we're engaged in, and so I think of the approach that I take as much more permissive, in the sense in which there's very little which isn't allowed into the world of philosophy. I think philosophy has functioned institutionally in universities, in particularly, well, everywhere, but say somewhere like in Australia for sure. In Sydney, they had the philosophy department divided into two, became traditional and modern, and I forget what the other one was called. And that was a distinction between analytic and continental, and that was to do somehow with Australia's participation in the Vietnam War.
Yep. I'm aware.
And those people, were kind of divorced for 30, 40 years. Then they were kind of forced back together by the university administration, and I hope they're doing better now. But it's so I think the idea that philosophy sees itself as a kind of a guild, like a medieval guild, where you need to serve your apprenticeship and do your time, and you have your masters, and those masters have their masters, and you slowly learn the trade over many years, and you work on your little thing and move up the ladder. And I think kind of fuck all that, really. I don't care. I think it's important to have teachers for sure and have access to interesting people, but the guild structure, the inward looking guild structure, which is all about saying, this is a philosopher and this is not a philosopher. This is the real stuff and this is bullshit. I think is just is tedious and has gone absolutely nowhere. And so to hell with that.
Yeah, that certainly is your anarchist tendencies coming out there. Um, all right, Professor. I wanna be cognizant of the time, given we have about a half an hour left, because I really want to ask you about Heidegger. I'm sorry if this compliment is gonna make you feel uncomfortable, but even though I was made aware of you as a person, as a human being, about a year ago when your book Memory Theater was recommended to me, which was just excellent little book. I came across your lectures on Heidegger during the pandemic, and I was bored. I had nothing to do, and I was like, I need to do something. So I started reading Heidegger's basic writings, and then I went on YouTube, found Hubert Dreyfus's lectures, which were really good, and then
Mhm.
I came across yours, and I was like, this is it. This is where it is. It was so well, clearly articulated, but at the same time, I felt you were touching at something, which it's kind of like to use an example or like an analogy here. I believe Kierkegaard has this idea that the way a Christian becomes a Christian is retroactively. It's not that you see reasons for God and you're like, oh, therefore God exists, but rather you become a Christian and then you post hoc come up with the reasons for God's existence. For me, that's
Mhm.
how I feel a lot about Heidegger and the phenomenologists and the existentialists. It's once you understand the way they see the world, you start seeing reasons for their metaphysical categories, let's say. Again, I truly appreciate the fact that you put up.
Great. It is a kind of, I mean, Heidegger's being in time is a kind of conversion experience, which is
Exactly.
not unrelated to the Christian tradition. Let's just put it that way. So, and this is the Apply-degger stuff that
Apply-degger,
you.
yes, the lectures you put up on YouTube for free, yeah. So, and then after that, along with that, to prepare for this podcast, I started reading your introduction to Heidegger, the Routledge book, which is also
Mhm.
excellent. But having said that, before we get there, I have to ask you about Memory Theater because more as a favor for a lot of my friends who'll be listening to this who love this book. So I first of all, it's a very kind of interesting, even in fact, you say this in one of your interviews on, I think, the 3 a.m. magazine, where you say that memory theater
Right.
is a critique of philosophy. I guess my question would be, what was the experience of writing a work of fiction, a semi-biographical work of fiction, but also why you say that this book is a critique of philosophy or a philosopher for that matter?
The dismantling of the image of the philosopher in the UK edition. There were photographs by my friend Liam Gillick of a skyscraper being built, which we just reversed. So we began with the skyscraper, and there were these photographs, which you just go back to this construction site. So trying to dismantle that image of the philosopher, that self-serving, grandiloquent idea of the philosopher by that's what I mean by that. And it's an attempt to, you know, self-critique, self-parody. Um, it's many things. It's a weird book, and some of it is true, and some of it is not true. And I wrote it in I think, a short but not that short, but a fit of not a fit of passion, a kind of fit of passion, and it just began to fall into place. And I thought, why not? Why not try and experiment with the form of fiction and see how that goes? And I was kind of enabled in that by I did a lot of work with a really close friend of mine called Tom McCarthy, who wrote a book called Remainder and has written a number of other really important novels. And Tom and I did lots of stuff for many years. And he kind of sort of loosened my tongue a little bit. He gave me more, he emboldened me to sort of push harder in that direction and to sort of relax a little bit and see if I could try this different form. So yeah, that's memory theatre. It's and it does also contain, my original idea for a PhD thesis on Hegel, which is strange. It was good to squeeze that in there, and it's full of daft and strange ideas, and ideas which I'm very attached. I was actually very interested in idea of mnemonics and how you would train a memory and so on and so forth. So it comes out of some long-standing obsessions I've had, but then I found a way of knitting it together into a story, and it ends it ends rather not tragically, in a kind of minor key, I guess. So
Yeah, I
yeah,
love how you touch on all variety of philosophers and to astrology to the it's I feel like
mad.
yeah, it's sort of like it seems like all your work, all your life's work you've done to write this book in some sense.
It's a doing of that. It's a dismantling of it, and it's an attempt to make that ridiculous and
It's a bit of a
comical.
self-parody for sure.
Yeah, and it's also serious. I mean, there is, the um it's there is something absolutely, pathetic about what people like us do. So why not? And if it provides a way in for somebody, then great. And I and I hope to do something else like that in the future. I'm thinking about it. I've been thinking about it for years, but then other things get in the way. But yeah, and Michel, the character at the center of it, much of that did happen, and some of it didn't. And
That's for the reader to find out. So does this mean
really,
that you'll be you're hoping to release another work of fiction in the future?
I mean, my agent wants me to, but I have to
I'm sure
find
they do. Yeah.
the right idea. The next book is on mysticism, which is
Fascinating.
and that's a book I've been. I think with books, I mean, in general, it the temporality of books is very different from out there than it is in here. For in here, it's always as if these books have taken forever. They've taken decades to produce, and but it looks so. I might look sort of fast from the outside, but it feels incredibly slow from the inside. So this mysticism book really has been 10 years, 12 years of thinking about these questions, and finally the damn thing is done. It's going to come out in October. But of course, by that time, I'm already completely bored with it, and then you have to kind of fake an interest in the book in order to be able to talk about it, which is painful. Then it gets a bit better afterwards. But let's get back to Heidegger.
Excellent, excellent. Now it's a good insight into as someone trying to, well, I've been in the process of writing a short novel for the past 2 years. And so it's good advice to kind of to go through the pain and suffering of putting something out. Although it is quite interesting because some days you feel like you can't do anything else but write. And then other days it's just absolute dread and misery. So
You
yeah.
just got to keep. It's all about finding the rhythm and maintaining it. It's about I mean, the only way you get books written is by doing a little bit every day.
Yeah.
And then and a lot of those days will be average days and some will be bad, but then there'll be some good days and then there'll be some good periods. So the mysticism book, there's one, I think I had a golden period of about 5 or 6 weeks where I was getting up at 6 in the morning and I was really focused and then it all fell apart. So but you have those, but you just have to keep showing up and persisting and not procrastinating and never allow yourself the luxury of an empty page. So always to have notes. I could talk a lot about note taking because note taking is really the key to everything. But you want to go back to Heidegger?
For sure, for sure. I'd love to ask you more about this because it's starting to become
What
really
can I say
helpful, but
how it came into existence? Because it's I mean so Apply-degger was um I I've been teaching being in time off and on for many years, and I knew that I didn't want to write a book on being in time because it was too much effort, and I spent too much time with Heideggerians over the years, and I thought, no, I'm not doing that. No, to hell with them. And also when I teach being in time, I've got the notes are really messy, and they're from different periods, and then there'll be sort of pages inserted where I'll make some suggestion, and so I can kind of stitch that together into the cocktail of a lecture. And then I thought in 2019 that I should record these because I have access to a studio. A friend of mine runs a studio, and I thought I'd go in and record. So I began to do that, and then the pandemic happened, and there was a break of a few weeks, and somebody gave me a microphone and a preamp. I learned to use GarageBand at home. My producer was still in New York, and so we were able to kind of figure out how to do it. And then we began to we kept on recording, got 18 episodes, and then put them out on the Onassis channel, which was great. And then it's funny how that I mean that's really I get sometimes get an email from somebody a cyclist in Japan who's been listening to it on their way to work, and you think, oh, that's good. That's a new thing. So yeah, it's an interesting experiment to try and explain the whole of being in time in ways that are true to the text, and more accessible than working your way through the sheer ugly horror of the 437 pages of
yeah,
being in time.
yeah,
The ideas are great. The ideas in Heidegger are fantastic, and you can get them quickly. But it's surrounded with this ornamentation, this foliage, and Heidegger is very good at putting people off the track, and getting them to think about other questions, which other than what he's really saying. And so it's yeah, and now we're trying to turn that slowly into a book at some point. Yeah.
that's an excellent idea, Professor. Because I still prefer reading over listening because it's more
Yes.
focused time. But as you said, this is exactly like the Japanese person, if I'm not mistaken. I listened to it while in Australia here we had a 5 kilometer radius, and I just like run around that radius, listen to your lectures. That was mostly my time during the pandemic, and
Yeah.
it was excellent. I loved it. So but as I did mention before, I came across your lectures. I also did listen to some by Hubert Dreyfus, and I really wanted to ask you this question, and I'm honestly grateful that I now have the opportunity. So I find that from the Heideggerians I've read and I kind of listen to. Hubert Dreyfus is more of like has like a pragmatic reading of Heidegger, especially because he's involved in this whole AI debate. So my question would be, Simon, how does your reading of Heidegger differ from that of someone like Hubert Dreyfus?
Right. Well, Dreyfus initially, when he published his lectures that he'd given, I think pretty much every year at Berkeley on being in time, that came out as a book called Being in the World in the late 80s, and it was just on division one of being in time. So Dreyfus's focus is on division one, and Dreyfus is someone who is, I mean, a very, very good philosopher, and someone who I had very, very good interactions with over the years. But philosophically, he doesn't appreciate, I was going to say understand, doesn't really give much weight to the phenomenological background to Heidegger's being in time and his relationship to Husserl. So that book that you had with the yellow leaf on the cover, that's an attempt to show how Heidegger's being in time really comes out of his reading of Husserl. Now, for Dreyfus, that's just Husserl's just consciousness. It's consciousness, and you've got to, Heidegger is a step away from that. That's wrong. And the other thing that's really wrong is the his incomprehension, his playing down an incomprehension of division two of being in time. And division two of being in time is really, for me, where the action is. Division one is full of fascinating concepts, which lead up to the care structure ahead of itself, being already in a world alongside entities, projection, thrownness, falling, existentiality, facticity, everyday life, and you can see what Heidegger's doing in the first division of being in time, in terms that someone like Dreyfus can make sense of. Sounds patronizing, that he can exploit for his own philosophical benefits, and what Bert says about what computers can't do, which was already in the late 60s, and how that has influenced a lot of debates in Silicon Valley, and a lot of the contemporary debates on AI would be very well served by reading Dreyfus on those questions, because AI is a lot harder than people think, and the threat is not some kind of replication of the human. The threat is of a kind of a new form of technological servitude, which I think is it's a different kind of problem. Anyway, but division two is where things really get cooking for me. And you can't understand division two of being in time without understanding Heidegger's relationship to Christianity, and division two is where we get a kind of conversion narrative, being towards death, conscience, guilt, ecstatic temporality, and history are these key terms, and that's Heidegger. So what makes Heidegger's being in time so powerful as a book is that we have phenomenology, description of life as it is lived, and an attempt to describe the meaning of that life, and that's great. But that was kind of all there in Husserl and some of Heidegger's contemporaries like Scheler and Jaspers, and that's all fine. But what Heidegger does is to mix that together with this conversion narrative about how a self emerges, and a conversion narrative without God, and where what we end up with in being in time is the experience of a finite, groundless self who is really nothing, right? Nothing but its own movement, and it's so being in time is an incredibly radical book, and the the first division can be understood in terms that would be that Hubert Dreyfus would agree with, but division two is where things really get radical, and that's what I tend to focus on. So there'd be two points of difference. There are others as well, but I like work a lot.
Sorry, say that again, Simon. You said you like.
I like Bert Dreyfus's work a lot.
Yeah, he is also a very good teacher, like yourself. Like, I mean, his lectures were a fantastic introduction. I mean, before I even read anything by Heidegger, I listened to his lectures, and they were really useful.
One thing he did for me, which was great, was that because he was a friend of Terrence Malick, the movie
Filmmaker.
director,
Yeah.
and Malick was I wrote this lecture on Malick in about 2001 on his movie The Thin Red Line. It's the first time I tried to write about movies, and he got it to Malick, and Malick liked it, and that was very exciting because Malick is someone who was a fully formed philosopher, with a PhD that he wasn't being encouraged to write, and then decide to switch forms and to go over into movies rather than to write books. And I think this opens the interesting question of what it would mean to kind of think on film, which is what someone like Malick is doing. And Bert Dreyfus was very kind in helping me get in touch with Malick.
Yeah, I really have to watch Thin Red Line. I've been recommended that film by many people. In fact, I had a Lacanian psychoanalyst on, and she was also speaking highly of that film. Probably my weekend project. All right, Simon. I guess can you give me about 15 more minutes of your time? Is that okay?
Yeah.
Excellent. Because I really do want to ask you this about the idea of subjective. Why is Heidegger not a dogmatic subjectivist or idealist? And I just for the viewer, I think this is a really important excerpt. You claim in this book on Heidegger's Being and Time in page 28. It's a bit of a mouthful, but you say, thus, perceptual experience is rendered intelligible through a process of ideation, generalized. I'll probably skip that part. And the important bit is, you speak about the universal and particular, and then you say, the important thing here is that this move from the particular to the universal takes place at the level of intuition. It is not something seen in the object and not a subjective construction. Oops, I think we lost Simon there again. Excellent. So just the last bit that I wanted to read out from that excerpt was, you say here the categorical forms are not the subjective constructs of acts, but the objects that manifest themselves in those acts. That was such an important little excerpt from the book, Simon. So I guess my
Well, that's
question.
from the Heidegger book, is it?
Yeah, that's correct. From your lecture introduction. Oh, sorry, from your lecture Heidegger for Beginners, which is about a 30-page lecture, and it's excellent. You speak about the a priori phenomenology. It's so good. But simply the question is, yeah, why is Heidegger not a dogmatic subjectivist or an idealist? What differentiates him from more of like a Berkeleyan idealist?
Well, he's not a Berkeleyan idealist because he doesn't believe that um, you know things are things are just perceptions which are in the head. So he's not an empirical idealist, right? So that's easy. He's not a dogmatic anything. He's taking the critical turn of Kant. You can see Heidegger's approach to say something like reality in paragraph 43 of Being and Time as, I think of it as an existential deepening of transcendental idealism. So transcendental idealism in Kant is the idea that we live in an empirically real world, right? There's a real world full of real stuff. That's indisputable, and that wasn't the case for Berkeley. But that world is a world which we give order to, we give shape to, and that's what Kant thinks the categories of the understanding are what give shape and order to that empirically real world. So Kant's claim is that an empirical realist is also a transcendental idealist, that the world is indeed a really real world, but it's a world which is shaped and ordered by human activity, or it's observer dependent, you could say. And I see that as that's true. What that Kant's problem is that Kant operates for Heidegger at the level of what he calls the present at hand, so that Kant's philosophy for Heidegger is the right intuition with the wrong ontology. Heidegger thinks that the present at hand, by which he means seeing the world with philosopher's spectacles, seeing the world in intellectualist terms, theoreticist terms, seeing the world and then asking questions like, well, how do I know that you've got a mind, or you're a robot, or how do you know that I am who I say I am, and so on and so forth. All of these questions arise with the wrong ontology, the ontology of the present at hand. So what Heidegger tries to do in Being and Time is to give us another ontology, which is an ontology of the ready to hand, of the handiness, of the availability of the world. And this is where Dreyfus is right. This is a kind of pragmatist approach. And Heidegger's pragmatism, in quotation marks, it's both realist and idealist, right? It's both committed to the idea that there's a really real world, and that really real world is something which is shaped and apprehended by the observers that understand that world. And so, and if there's a philosopher that I think is most similar to Heidegger certainly in the American tradition, it would be William James. And James develops in his late work, his unfinished work, this idea of what he calls radical empiricism. And I see Heidegger as being pretty consistent with that. And that's an attempt. How do you? And so Heidegger's question, this is also what's wrong with philosophy. What's wrong with philosophy is that philosophy reduces the flux of experience to concepts, to these static, abstract concepts like thinking substance or monad or whatever it might be. Heidegger is concerned with two things. He's concerned with movement, that whatever's going on is in movement. Everything is moving all the time. We live in a world of movement, and movement is time, and time is movement, and all of that. And how do we express movement? How do we say movement? Because if we say movement, we fix it. We reduce it to a kind of still point. How do we express movement as movement? Very hard thing to do, and something of which philosophy is quite bad at doing, with the exception of Heidegger. And I think Hegel's dialectic is a way of thinking about movement too. And the second thing it's about is meaning, right? That the world is meaningful for Heidegger. And that meaning is not in the head, that meaning is out there in the world. It's a meaning that we apprehend. The world just hangs together and is significant. That's just a fact. Then how do we describe that is the question, which he sets himself. So he's not. So that's how I understand Heidegger's position. And then in Division 2 of Being and Time, he takes all of that and just kind of spins it into another dimension, which is even more exciting. And does that help?
Absolutely, it does. In fact, just the last question on Heidegger, Simon, just because of time constraints. It's so why is it, again, a very naive question, but for a person who's a neophyte, why is it that Heidegger uses the category of a Dasein and introduces a Dasein instead
Mm.
of a cogito or a subject? What's unique about Dasein for Heidegger?
Heidegger's trying to invent a new language because he thinks that the language of the tradition is a language that blinds us because we think we understand what it means. So if I say I'm a mind, or I'm a person, or I'm a spirit, body, or I'm a brain, or whatever, we think we know what those things mean. And Heidegger's view is that tradition has to be destroyed. That's his it has to be destroyed. So he is committed in the larger project of which Being in Time is a part to basically the destruction of the history of philosophy. He thinks that modern philosophy in particular, and the criminal really is always Descartes for him. Descartes has reduced the world to a world of subjective experiences, of a reality which is understood as substance. And that is the wrong ontology for thinking about being in the world for him. So he uses the term Dasein. It's a term you can find in German. It's a perfectly ordinary term. It just means existence. And he uses that to designate us. And then the question is, well, is Dasein the human being? Well, yeah, we're Dasein, but then could there be Dasein beyond the human? And that's a question which, there's a lot of debate and interpretation about that. I think you could think about animal Dasein. There's a philosopher called John Hoagland who talks about you can have a Dasein of a city, Dasein of a whole place. So there could be a way you can get from Heidegger into. So Heidegger wants a name for who we are that is not just subjective, right? Because if we say subject, we think we understand. So Heidegger's strategy is to defamiliarize us with what we think we know, and to actually get us to start thinking. And for that, he thought we needed a new vocabulary. And the first item in that vocabulary is the idea of Dasein. So if you translate it as person, then you think, oh, well, I know what a person is, but then you miss the point. You've got to go with the kind of thought experiment that Heidegger is trying to get us to.
Yeah.
To Dasein is us, but as something really quite strange. I think he describes Dasein as the happening of strangeness, and I quite like that.
And I think it's probably why I've been reading Heidegger as you described. There is some sort of conversion experience once you start getting into the world of Heidegger.
Yep.
All right, Simon, to conclude, and I apologize if this question is going to make you cringe inside, but I'd like to ask, how does one become a good philosopher?
Well, you need. I remember I was reading there's a great book by Brian Eno called The Year with Swollen Appendices. The Year with Swollen Appendices. It came out, and it's basically his journal of, I think it was 1994, and then it was brought out, a 20-year edition was brought out, and it touches on some really interesting themes. But he talks in that place about in that book about the idea of scenius, not genius, but scenius, SCENIUS, that in order to do something interesting, there needs to be a scene. There needs to be other people, and there needs to be other people in some kind of you could say friendly competition, of there being, and he's thinking obviously about popular music in let's say the 70s and 80s, where there were scenes, different scenes, and to be in a band was to be part of a scene, and so I think you need that. I think you need a scene, and universities used to be scenes. They used to be places where interesting thinking happened because there were people who were a little bit unhinged, people that perhaps should have been, institutionalized in mental facilities who were teaching, but they were fascinating people, and there was an incredible freedom, and so I became a philosopher because I just found the people teaching philosophy to be really interesting, and I couldn't figure out how they were doing what they were doing. I went to university late when I was 22, and I went to do literature because I thought that's what I wanted to do. But and philosophy was my fourth option in my first year. But then when I started to go to this philosophy class with a brilliant philosopher called Jay Bernstein, I thought this is just much more interesting than the other stuff. And then I got hooked and carried on. So, but for me, it was being part of a scene and being part of a group, and also with that group there being certain standards you had to hit. There was certain work that was expected of you, and your peers were doing it, and you wanted to do work that was as good as them. So I think a little bit of rivalry and competition, is a bit of agonism, is helpful. I think the real problem in education is there are many problems in education which usually focus on issues around academic freedom, but I think it's much more an issue of are there scenes, are there actually places where you can go where an education is really happening amongst teachers and students, most importantly amongst students. And I think that's really up for grabs. And the COVID pandemic has made that a lot more. Obviously, it was devastating for that. And who knows what the implications of that of COVID are going to be for education in years to come. But you need other people, and you need one or two teachers that you trust and you like and you can learn something from. And then you need to be given the time to develop and to stay away from publishing early, and to take the time it takes to develop your own line of thinking. It's I mean, I wouldn't I'm not sure I'd recommend it anymore. I think it's I mean, academia has become a place of underpaid, overworked people who have pretty precarious lives, and research has been commodified, and the idea of producing bold, original work is not really rewarded. So why would you do it? But then the question is, well, is that energy elsewhere? Are there other areas of culture where you could say, well, this is where the thinking is going on? And the nice thing about being in a city, perhaps, is that often in cities you can just find people who are interested in thinking about things, who'll be doing various lines of work. And so I think a lot of it has become, a lot of what is interesting now has become much more informal. Reading groups, podcasts, I mean, all sorts of things have taken the place of what universities used to do. And but it should be free and it should be hard work.
That's
and yeah.
I mean, it's only philosophers are the only people that would say that would tell others to not get into their vocation, which I love.
Mhm. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, anyone who wants to do a PhD, we tell them to get their head examined. You try to dissuade them, right? This is going to be a disastrous choice for you.
Yeah.
If they persist, in doing it, well, then we can do it,
Yeah.
and we will do it really, we'll do it really well.
Yeah.
And but you know, don't say I didn't tell you.
Yeah.
And
I
it's
mean,
all, yeah, there was never a great period when things were good. It was always when I
exactly.
was a student, there were no jobs in the UK, academic jobs between 1977 and 1988. Not one. So in the humanities. So I was a student, and we had no idea that we would go on to get paid to think, because there were no such jobs were available. So I think that's the best way to approach it. I mean, to think about it. You're doing this because you want to do it, because you can't really do anything else, or you can't really live a life without doing this, and you're just gonna do it. And if you do it for a reward, or for gold points, or some monetary outcome, it's a catastrophic decision. And hopefully, if you do it for the right reasons, something good might happen.
Indeed, indeed. Well, I can say this, Simon, despite the discontents of the neoliberal university, I can't see myself doing anything else other than pursuing academic life. So, and thank you to people like yourself who do the public work, and yeah, for the to use a very kind of like pathetic term, for inspiring others to
Well,
engage.
thank you very much. I'm very flattered by that. So thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Thanks for your time,
All right.
Simon. Really appreciate it.